Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're gonna unpack the hilarious, often downright painful, and honestly incredibly relatable struggles of learning a second language. We are basing today's journey on this fantastic Vietnamese stand-up comedy routine that just perfectly captures the absolute chaos of trying to master English. So, let me ask you this. Have you ever studied a language for years, like meticulously learning the grammar, memorizing the vocabulary, only to realize that when you finally try to speak it out loud, no one understands a single word you're saying? Yeah, it's a completely universal experience. We get so caught up in the rigid, confusing process of learning that the ultimate goal of the language, which, let's remember, is literally just communicating with another human being, completely gets lost in the shuffle.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it kicks off trap number 1, the literal translation trap, or when words betray us.
See, this trap happens when our brains naturally try to map our native language directly onto a new one. A really perfect example of this comes from a beginner English student in Vietnam who was trying to figure out the word for watermelon. Now, logically, they knew the English word for lemon translates to chun in Vietnamese. They also knew a watermelon is, well, very watery, so, following strict logic, they assumed that a watery, lemon-like fruit must obviously be a water lemon. I mean, it makes perfect sense in their head, right? But unfortunately, pure logic doesn't always apply to language. And honestly, it gets even trickier with basic grammar. Take a super simple English phrase like beautiful eyes. If you do a literal word-for-word translation using Vietnamese sentence structure, you get đẹp con mắt, which translates directly back to beautiful the eye. Learners end up speaking completely backwards sentences. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit. It trips up learners constantly and causes so much confusion. Moving right along, here is trap number 2, the immersion experiment, or searching for the perfect environment.
Because, well, when literal translation clearly doesn't work, what is the next logical step? Total immersion. The comedian shares his own desperate journey of trying to just force language acquisition. His self-study attempts were a total disaster. First, he tried reading English books by looking for keywords. But hey, finding keywords doesn't actually help if you don't know what they mean. Then he tried watching the movie The Last Samurai and fell completely asleep in exactly 15 minutes. So, taking drastic measures, he packed his bags and flew all the way to an international English school in the Philippines, just to force himself into a strict English-only environment. But here's the thing. Immersion brings its own totally unique set of culture clashes. Imagine this scene, okay? The comedian is hanging out in his dorm room with his really friendly Korean roommate. The roommate confidently points to a suspicious brown stain on his own pants and yells, "Happy coffee!" He was just trying to explain that he spilled his coffee and it happened to land on his pants, but it came out as happy coffee. It is such a hilarious reminder that extreme confidence in an immersive environment absolutely does not equal grammatical correctness. And his immersion went deep, maybe a little too deep, actually. The speaker recounts waking up in the middle of the night to what he genuinely thought was a ghost staring at him from the doorway. His reaction? Instead of screaming in his native Vietnamese like a normal person, his immersion training completely hijacked his brain. He literally tried to reason with the supernatural entity using highly formal academic English, announcing to the empty room that he was an international student just there to study computers. I mean, when you start using formal vocabulary to negotiate with spirits, you know the immersion has officially taken over the whole shebang. Let's move to and see how this builds into trap number 3, forced English at work, and the dreaded 50,000 VND fine. So what happens when that immersion isn't a choice, but is actually forced upon you in a corporate environment? The comedian tells this story about working at an agency where the boss desperately wanted to prepare the local team for global clients. His grand solution? A strict English day rule. Speak even one single word of Vietnamese on a Wednesday, and you have to pay a 50,000 VND fine straight out of your own pocket. It was, theoretically, meant to foster dynamic global communication. But instead of a bustling, globalized office, there was absolute, dead silence. The boss awkwardly greeted his own familiar staff with the phrase, "Nice to meet you." Coworkers desperately fell back on basic textbook phrases, asking each other, "How many people in your family?" just to fill the agonizing quiet without getting fined. Eventually, everyone just gave up and put on their headphones to avoid human contact entirely. It perfectly proves that artificially forcing a language often kills communication altogether. Which brings us to trap number 4, the curse of complexity, or trying to sound smart. This taps into a major psychological barrier in language learning. The comedian Hill Zevanan has a great joke about the thesaurus. He clarifies, it's not a type of dinosaur, but rather a highly dangerous tool that students use. Why? Because there is this pervasive fear that if you use simple, everyday words, people are going to look down on you. So a perfectly fine, clear sentence like I go to school gets needlessly mutated into something ridiculous like I go to the academy to absorb knowledge. It doesn't make you sound smarter, it literally just makes you sound like a robot.
And then there's the obsession with idioms. Language teachers love teaching idioms. But just think about the absurd literal meanings of these forced phrases when a non-native speaker tries to visualize them. You are the apple of my eye sounds like a terrifying medical condition, like an actual apple stuck inside your eyeball. Or butterflies in my stomach sounds like a literal swarm of insects living inside your digestive tract. Memorizing these feels so incredibly unnatural when you're just trying to have a normal human conversation.
And because of this intense pressure to sound complex, teachers actually teach students these little exam tricks to fake their fluency. They rely on massive, empty filler sentences like, "That is a fantastic question. I have never thought about it. Give me a minute." Students are quite literally trained to rattle off these giant blocks of text during speaking tests just to stall for time while their brain frantically scrambles in the background to find the actual vocabulary. Add to that the intense pressure to fake a perfect British or American accent. The comedian notes that this pressure usually results in students adopting bizarre television personas rather than just, being themselves. You end up with students who speak with the aggressive, fast-paced energy of a sports commentator, or the hushed, dramatic tones of an Animal Planet narrator. Or they just try to make their accent sound excessively windy and breathy, hoping it sounds authentic. All of this effort just goes into sounding like someone else entirely. And that leads us to trap number 5. Language is for connection, or the ultimate realization. Because where does all this overcomplication and acting actually lead? The comedian shares a really pivotal story from his time working as an art director. He was in a meeting with a Malaysian director and decided, okay, it's time to flex his English muscles. He delivered this highly complex, grammatically flawless, thesaurus-heavy critique regarding the project's pre-production, the specific focal length of the camera, and the nuances of the lighting setup. And the result? He received a totally blank stare from the director. It was a complete and utter communication failure. And this brilliantly illustrates the real issue, because the producer, noticing the total confusion in the room, stepped in and translated the comedian's complex jargon into a simple phrase. He said, "Okay, now later, not later now." It is completely grammatically broken. It uses absolutely zero advanced vocabulary. But guess what? The director instantly understood exactly what needed to happen, and the meeting successfully moved forward. This is the core takeaway we really want you to grasp. Language is meant to connect, not to isolate. All that strict grammar, the forced accents, the bizarre idioms, and the complex thesaurus words, they are completely and utterly worthless if the person sitting across from you doesn't understand what you mean. The true role of language is to share feelings and ideas, not to build a towering wall of complexity between you and the rest of the world. So we're going to leave you with this final thought today. When you're learning or speaking a new language, ask yourself honestly, are you speaking to truly connect with others, or are you just speaking to sound smart? Because if it's the latter, you might just be trapping yourself. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer, and we really hope this helps you focus on what actually matters in your learning journey.